There are places in the galaxy where memory goes to die. Not the memory of men, that is fragile, easily lost to fire or time, or the merciful erosion of guilt. Number. This is the memory of existence itself, the kind that should never have been formed, the kind that, once known, changes the shape of reality like a stone dropped into still water, ripples expanding forever outward, disturbing the careful lies we tell ourselves about what we are. On the edge of the ultima segmentum, beyond the light of terror's guiding fire, there was such a place, a world with no name, only a designation, archival station Theta 17. Once, perhaps, it had been something more, a planet with weather and seasons, with indigenous life that crawled or flew or simply endured. But that was before the Imperium found it, before the excavators came with their cathedral ships and their hunger for the past. What remained was a monument to thoroughness. The atmosphere had been processed, filtered, made breathable but sterile. The oceans, if there had ever been oceans, were gone, leaving only salt flats that stretched to horizons too distant to comprehend. The sky was the color of old parchment, yellowed and sick. When the twin suns rose, they cast no warmth, only a pale light that seemed to apologize for existing at all. The station itself crouched at the center of these wastes, like a malformed spider, hab domes of corroded plasteel, sanctified trenches carved deep into the planetary crust, laboratorium spires that reached toward the dying sky as if in prayer, though nothing divine had listened here for a very long time. 347 souls lived and worked within its iron embrace, tech priests with more metal than flesh, scribes whose eyes had been replaced with augmetic sensors better suited to reading ancient texts, military personnel who stood watch over nothing and everything simultaneously. They had been sent here for a singular purpose, to catalogue what had been found, the relic, the skull. It had been discovered 17 months prior, buried beneath 4 kilometers of compressed sediment in a stratum that predated the Imperium by millennia. Perhaps longer. The dating methods had failed, returned contradictory results, or simply refused to function when brought near the thing. Magos Explorator Vardanis, who led the dig, had described its discovery in his report with uncharacteristic poetry. We found it sleeping in the dark, and when we brought light, we saw that it was dreaming. That report was the last coherent transmission from Theta 17. The skull was neither human nor Xenos. It was both. It was something worse than both. In the grim darkness of the far future, humanity clings to its definition of itself with the desperation of a drowning man clutching a blade. We are human, pure, ordained by the Emperor to inherit the stars, to suggest otherwise, to whisper that perhaps we were not always what we are, that our genesis might be tainted, shared, collaborative with something other. This is not merely heresy. It is an existential wound. The skull suggested exactly that. And so, in the way of the Imperium, those who studied it were left to their work in silence. No supply ships came. No astropathic communications were answered. The station and its inhabitants became a secret kept from the Imperium itself, a splinter working its way deeper into flesh, waiting either to be expelled or to fester into something fatal. This is the chronicle of what they found. This is the chronicle of what found them. Faith in the Imperium is not a comfort. It is a burden carried across centuries, pressed down upon shoulders until the spine curves, until the soul assumes the shape of its cage. The priests aboard Theta 17 understood this intimately. Father Gregorius Vale had served the ministorum for 63 years. His face was a leather mask stretched over sharp bone, eyes sunk deep into their sockets like creatures hiding from light. He had witnessed 17 crusades, administered last rites to more soldiers than he could count, stood in the ash of burned worlds, and declared them sanctified. He had never doubted. Doubt was a luxury, a small madness reserved for those with time to indulge it. Now he doubted. The chapel within the station was a modest thing, a repurposed cargo hold, with an altar fashioned from supply crates and a crude aquila welded from scrap metal. The prayers still worked here, technically. The litanies still held their rhythm, but the words felt hollow, like speaking into a void that had learned to mimic the shape of listening without the substance. Gregorius spent his days maintaining the spiritual quarantine of the research staff, blessing the tools of excavation, performing minor exorcisms on equipment that began to malfunction in strange ways, temperature gauges that displayed numbers in languages no one recognized, cogitators that whispered prayers backward during startup cycles, small corruptions, ignorable corruptions, except they were not small, and they could not be ignored. The skull sat in Laboratory 7, suspended in a stasis field generated by technology that predated the Mechanicus by epochs. No one could explain how the field still functioned. No one wanted to try deactivating it to find out. Gregorius had seen the skull only once. That had been enough. It was approximately the size of a human skull, baseline, adult, male. But the proportions were wrong in ways that hurt to perceive. The cranium was too elongated, swept back like the skull of something built for speed, for thinking in dimensions that required additional space for processing. The eye sockets were larger, positioned slightly too far apart, suggesting a visual range that encompassed more than mere light. The jaw was elegant, almost delicate, with teeth that were human in number but not quite in shape. But it was the bone itself that disturbed most profoundly. Human bone is ivory white when clean, yellow with age. Xenos bone comes in a spectrum depending on the species: chitinous blacks, crystalline purples, organic metals. This bone was something else. It seemed to shift between states depending on the angle of observation, the lighting, the intention of the observer. Sometimes it appeared ancient beyond measure, brittle and holy. Other times it looked fresh, still warm, as if the thing had died only moments ago. Embedded in the skull were markings, not carved, not etched. They were part of the bone's structure, woven into it at a molecular level. The Mechanicus adepts had attempted to decode them for months. Some claimed they were genetic markers. Others insisted they were mathematical formulae describing the curvature of spacetime. A few, the ones who stopped sleeping, said they were names, the names of all possible futures. Gregorius did not pretend to understand the technical analyses. He understood only that the thing radiated wrongness, the way a furnace radiates heat. Standing in its presence was like standing before a mirror that showed you not your reflection, but the person you would have been if a single decision, thousands of years ago, had gone differently. It made him feel like an echo. The research staff felt it too, though they expressed it differently. The tech priests became obsessed with purity protocols, performing the same diagnostic rituals dozens of times per day, as if repetition could stabilize something that had no interest in remaining stable. The scribes developed nervous habits, compulsive note-taking, excessive cross-referencing, organizing data into patterns that meant nothing but felt necessary. And the soldiers, the poor soldiers, stood their watches and said nothing. But Gregorius saw it in their eyes, the way they looked at each other across the mess hall, searching for confirmation that they were still real, still themselves, still the same people they had been yesterday. The station operated on a 28-hour cycle, 4 hours longer than standard Terra time. No one could remember why this schedule had been chosen. It meant that sleep came at odd hours, that the body never fully adjusted, that existence became a fugue state of semi-wakefulness punctuated by dreams that felt more coherent than reality. In the third week after the skull's installation in Laboratory 7, 3 research assistants requested reassignment. Denied. In the 5th week, a scribe named Omalus tried to access the external airlocks without authorization. He was restrained, sedated, questioned. He could not explain why. He said only that he needed to leave, that something about the station's air tasted wrong, that breathing it was changing him in ways he couldn't articulate. They confined him to the medical ward. He died 2 days later. Cause of death, respiratory failure. His lungs had simply stopped processing oxygen, as if they had forgotten their purpose. No one spoke of him again. Gregorius conducted the funeral rites alone. The body was cremated according to protocol, the ashes scattered across the salt flats during a brief surface excursion. As he watched the gray particles dissolve into the gray dust, he found himself wondering if the distinction mattered. Ash and dust, living and dead, human and other. The wind moved through the broken spires like a choir of ghosts. Magos Vardanis no longer remembered his original name. This was not unusual for a senior adept of the Mechanicus. The flesh name, the designation given by biological parents in a moment of sentimental weakness, was shed like dead skin as one progressed along the path to the Omnissiah's perfection. Vardanis had become himself through progressive augmentation, neural implants, cognitive enhancers, memory cores that expanded his consciousness across distributed networks. He was, in the truest sense, more machine than man. This had always been a source of pride. The weakness of flesh transcended, the limitations of organic cognition overcome. He could process 17,000 discrete data points simultaneously, maintain 8 separate lines of inquiry without degradation, operate for 72 hours without rest. But the skull had introduced him to a new sensation, uncertainty, not doubt, uncertainty. A recognition that the frameworks he used to understand reality were insufficient, that the very language of knowledge itself might be a provincial dialect spoken only in a tiny corner of a much larger conversation. The skull was impossible, not in the casual sense that ignorant men used the word, meaning merely unlikely or unexpected, impossible in the absolute sense. Its existence violated principles that the Mechanicus considered sacrosanct, truths engraved into the architecture of the universe itself. The bone was organic, but it did not decay. Carbon dating returned results spanning from 3,000 years old to negative 6 million years, a date in the future. The molecular structure was consistent with human bone, but contained amino acid sequences that did not exist in any known genome, human or xenos. Some of these sequences appeared to be actively rewriting themselves, adapting to observation, as if aware they were being studied. Most disturbing, the skull emitted a faint electromagnetic signature that matched, with 98% accuracy, the neural pattern of human consciousness. It was thinking, or remembering, or dreaming. Vardanis had constructed 12 separate hypotheses to explain the skull's existence, each supported by rigorous analysis and each ultimately inadequate. The skull existed in a state of superposition, simultaneously conforming to and violating every theoretical model he applied to it. He had begun to suspect that this was intentional, that the skull was not an artifact, but a message, and that its impossible nature was part of the content. The message, as near as he could discern, was this: "You are not the origin. You have never been the origin." In the long nights, or were they days? Time had become negotiable. Vardanis found himself conducting thought experiments that would have been deemed heretical by any magos biologies worth their electu. What if humanity was not a singular species, but a convergence point? What if the template that became Homo sapiens was itself derived from something older, something that had seeded genetic code across multiple worlds, multiple timelines? What if every human being carried within their DNA the echoes of this progenitor race, dormant instructions waiting for the proper stimulus to activate? The skull could be a key, or a warning, or both. Laboratory 7 had become a temple to unanswerable questions. The walls were covered in data slate printouts, formulae scrawled in multiple notations, diagrams that attempted to visualize 11-dimensional mathematics using 3-dimensional representations. Tech acolytes shuffled between workstations like devotees performing rituals they no longer understood, but dared not abandon. At the center of it all, the skull floated in its stasis field, serene and terrible. Vardanis had taken to addressing it directly. This was illogical behavior, a symptom of cognitive degradation brought on by exhaustion and prolonged exposure to anomalous phenomena. He did it anyway. "What were you?" he asked the skull during the 13th hour of a work cycle. His voice, processed through a voxcoder embedded in his throat, echoed metallically in the empty chamber. "What did you become?" The skull, of course, did not answer, but the silence felt deliberate, weighted with meaning. Vardanis reviewed the deep scan imagery for the 1000th time. There, barely visible even at maximum magnification, structures within the bone that resembled neural pathways. Not metaphorically, literally. The skull contained a nervous system, fossilized or preserved or something, complete with synaptic connections and what appeared to be glial support cells. A brain without a brain, consciousness without tissue. The implications spiraled outward into territories that the Mechanicus dogma had no map for. If intelligence could persist in bone, in structure alone, then what was the soul? What was the machine spirit? What separated the holy cogitator from the damned intelligence? What separated human from not human? In the 4th month of study, Vardanis made a decision that he knew he would not survive. He deactivated the stasis field. The skull woke. This is not the correct terminology. It did not wake because it had never truly slept. It simply became present in a way it had not been before, as if the stasis field had kept it suspended not in time, but in relevance, and now it was relevant again. The change was subtle at first. The lighting in Laboratory 7 began to flicker, but analysis of the power grid showed no fluctuations. The temperature dropped 3 degrees, then 4, then stabilized at a point just below comfortable. Instruments recorded faint auditory phenomena, subsonic vibrations that registered on equipment but not human ears, rhythmic patterns that suggested language or perhaps music. Vardanis felt it most profoundly. His augmetics, normally reliable to the microsecond, began experiencing latency. Commands took fractionally longer to execute. His memory cores reported no errors, but he found himself recalling events he had never experienced, walking through cities that had never been built, conversations with people who had never existed. Or perhaps they had. Perhaps they existed in a different arrangement of possibility, and the skull was showing him what could have been. Father Gregorius arrived at the laboratory in response to a summons he had not sent himself. He simply found himself walking there, moving through the station's corridors with the inevitability of water flowing downhill. When he arrived, Vardanis was standing before the skull, motionless, his optical senses fixed on it with an intensity that suggested communion. "Magos," Gregorius said. His voice felt small in the chamber's vastness. Vardanis did not turn. "It is speaking. I hear nothing, not in words, in patterns, probabilities. It is showing me what we were supposed to be." Gregorius approached slowly, as one might approach a wounded animal. "And what is that?" "More." The skull hung in the air, no longer suspended by technological means, but by will, its own or something else's. The markings on its surface were glowing now, not with light, but with attention, as if they were observing the observers. Gregorius felt the presence then, the weight of something vast and ancient turning its focus toward him. It was not malevolent. It was worse than malevolent. It was curious. "We should destroy it," Gregorius whispered. "We cannot," Vardanis replied. "It is already inside us, inside ourselves, inside our history. This is what we came from, Father. This is the template, the first draft of humanity, before we were edited, refined, reduced to something manageable. That is heresy. That is fact." Vardanis finally turned, and Gregorius saw that the Magos was weeping, or rather his tear ducts, long replaced with moisture control systems, were leaking lubricant in a parody of crying. The Emperor did not create humanity. He only inherited us. We are older than the Imperium, older than Terra. We are the children of something that decided to spread itself across the stars and see what would grow. The skull pulsed. Vardanis collapsed. The infection spread not through blood or air, but through understanding. Those who studied the skull, who spent hours in its presence, began to change, not physically, at least not at first, but conceptually. Their sense of self became fluid, negotiable. Scribes reported dreams where they possessed memories from multiple lives simultaneously, existing in parallel across contradictory histories. Tech priests found their augmetics responding to commands they had not issued, as if their mechanical components had developed initiative. The soldiers were affected differently. They began to see patterns in the static of Vox units, hear orders in the white noise of ventilation systems. 3 sentries on the eastern perimeter reported visual contact with figures moving across the salt flats, humanoid but wrong, proportioned like the skull, walking with a grace that human biomechanics could not achieve. No evidence of intrusion was found. The perimeter remained secure. But the sightings continued. Father Gregorius attempted to perform an exorcism on Laboratory 7. The rites, which had served the ecclesiarchy for 10,000 years, had no effect. Or rather, they had the opposite of the intended effect. The presence within the skull seemed to listen to the prayers with interest, absorbing them, learning from them. Midway through the ritual, Gregorius realized he was no longer speaking High Gothic, but something older, a proto-language that his mouth remembered even though his mind did not. The words felt correct in a way that Gothic never had, as if his tongue were finally forming sounds it had been designed for. He stopped himself, sealed the laboratory, recommended immediate evacuation of the station. His recommendation was noted and ignored. There was nowhere to evacuate to. The Imperium in its infinite wisdom, had already made Theta 17 disappear from all official records. They were ghosts haunting a world that officially did not exist, studying a relic that officially had never been found. In the 7th month, the transformations began. A junior researcher named Kellyan noticed that her fingernails had developed faint striations that matched the markings on the skull. She reported this to the medici, who documented it and could do nothing else. The striations spread, crawling up her fingers, across her hands, writing themselves into her skin like text on a page. She said they itched with knowledge. Another staff member, an older scribe whose name had been lost to paperwork errors, began speaking in languages that required 3 tongues to pronounce correctly. His mouth was adapting, restructuring itself to accommodate sounds that human vocal cords had never been meant to produce. Vardanis, who had been confined to the medici ward after his collapse, recovered but was no longer entirely himself. He moved with an eerie fluidity, his augmetics now integrated with his biology in ways that should not have been possible. He claimed to remember things that had not happened yet, events that existed in potential but not actuality. He said the skull was not from the past, it was from a future that had been prevented, a timeline where humanity had taken a different path, evolved into something magnificent and terrible, and then reached backward through time to plant seeds of itself in the evolutionary substrate. We were not discovering our origin. We were discovering our destination, and we were rejecting it. The human genome, Vardanis explained with a clarity that suggested madness or enlightenment or both, contained dormant sequences, junk DNA the biologists called it, evolutionary remnants with no apparent function. But what if those sequences were not remnants but instructions, deactivated code waiting for the proper signal to execute? The skull was that signal. Every human being aboard Theta 17 was being rewritten, restored to a template that existed outside of time. They were becoming what they had always been meant to be, transitional forms, chrysalises waiting to unfold into something new, or something old, or something that laughed at the distinction. Language began to fail. Not the ability to speak, that remained intact, but the capacity of words to convey meaning eroded day by day. The staff found themselves grasping for terminology that did not exist in Gothic, low or high, reaching for concepts that required new vocabulary, new grammatical structures, new ways of organizing thought itself. Gregorius conducted his final Mass on the first day of the 9th month. 17 souls attended. They sat in the makeshift chapel, heads bowed, and when Gregorius spoke the liturgy, they heard something beneath the words, a sub-harmonic frequency that carried the truth of what he was saying rather than the sanitized version the ecclesiarchy had approved. The emperor, he realized with a horror that transcended fear, had known, had always known. Humanity was a compromise, a treaty between what we had been and what we could never be allowed to become. The Imperium was not an expansion, but a containment, a quarantine against our own potential. The prayer died in his throat. That night, the skull spoke for the first time, not in sound, but in certainty. Every mind aboard the station received the same message simultaneously, not as words but as pure meaning, impossible to misinterpret or deny. You were children. You were meant to grow. They cut the growth from you and called it civilization. We are what you would have been if no one had been afraid. The station's population stood at 347 souls. By morning, that number had become meaningless. Some had died, or appeared to have died. Their bodies remained, but their consciousness had redistributed, bleeding out into the station's systems, into the air itself, becoming ambient. Others had merged, 2 or 3 individuals collapsing into singular entities that retained fragments of each component identity while forming something cohesively new. A few, a precious few, remained nominally human. Gregorius was among them, though he no longer knew if this was resilience or simply cowardice. The refusal to evolve. The clinging to a shape that had become too small for the thing inside it. Vardanis, or the entity that had been Vardanis, found him in the chapel. The magos moved like liquid mercury, his form suggesting mechanical components and biological tissue, without committing to either. "You should let go," Vardanis said, his voice a chorus. "The fear is the only thing keeping you trapped." "Trapped in what?" Gregorius asked. "In that." Vardanis gestured at Gregorius's body, his faith, his humanity. "In the lie that you are separate, distinct, an individual soul in an individual shell. You're not. You never were. You're a pattern, Father, information encoded in flesh, and information wants to be free." Gregorius felt tears on his face. Real tears this time, salt water and grief. "And if I let go, what happens then?" "Then you remember what you were always meant to be." Laboratory 7 was no longer a laboratory. It had become a threshold, a point of transition where the laws of the station, of reality, of human definition, no longer applied with full authority. The skull still floated at its center, but now it was surrounded by others, not physical skulls, but echoes, impressions, the shapes that consciousness assumed when freed from the obligation to inhabit a single body. They were beautiful, they were terrible, they were calling. Gregorius stood at the entrance for what might have been hours or minutes or weeks. Time had become an aesthetic choice rather than a constant. He could feel the pull, the invitation to step forward, to dissolve the boundaries that defined him, to join the consensus that was forming in the station's heart. Behind him, the last remnants of the Imperium, duty, faith, the Emperor's distant light. Before him, something older and newer, terrible and magnificent, offering a truth that would erase the question of who he was by answering it so completely that the question lost all meaning. He thought of Omalus, the scribe who had tried to leave, whose lungs had forgotten how to breathe. Perhaps that had been the first transformation, not death, but metamorphosis into something that did not require oxygen, that had moved beyond the crude chemistry of respiration into a more elegant form of existence. Perhaps they were all Omalus now, or becoming him, or he was becoming them. The categories had broken. Father Gregorius, who had served the Emperor for 63 years, who had never doubted even when doubt would have been merciful, made his choice. He stepped backward. He sealed the laboratory door. He walked to the station's command center and activated the emergency protocol, a system designed for catastrophic containment failure, a last resort when heresy had progressed beyond redemption. The station's reactor would overload in 17 minutes. Theta, 17, and everything it contained would be sterilized, reduced to ash and radiation, and eventually, if the Emperor was merciful, forgotten. Gregorius sat in the command chair and waited. Around him, through the walls, he could feel the others awakening to what he had done. Not anger. They had moved beyond anger. Disappointment, perhaps, sadness, the grief of a parent watching a child choose a cage over flight. The skull, the skulls, the presence reached out one final time. "Why?" Gregorius answered aloud, though there was no one left to hear who required sound. "Because humanity is not a truth, it is a decision, and I choose to remain what I am, even if what I am is incomplete. Then you will die incomplete. Yes, that is not mercy. No, Gregorius agreed, but it is mine. The explosion was silent. In the void of space, there is no atmosphere to carry the shock wave, no air to compress and expand in the thunder of destruction. Theta 17 simply ceased, converted in an instant from matter to energy, from question to answer. The blast could be seen from orbit, a brief flare of light against the parchment sky, fading quickly, leaving no scar. The salt flats absorbed the radiation, the dust settled. The wind, which had no memory, continued its endless movement across the dead world's surface. No debris survived, no records, no proof that the station had ever existed, that 347 souls had lived and studied and transformed there. The skull, the skulls, the presence, dispersed, not destroyed. You cannot destroy information, only relocate it. The pattern that the skull represented scattered into the cosmic background radiation, into the quantum foam of space-time, waiting with the patience of something that existed outside of temporal sequence, waiting to be found again. Because the truth is, the skull was never unique. It was simply the first to be discovered in this iteration of history. Across the galaxy, on worlds forgotten and worlds not yet named, others sleep in the deep places, in the strata beneath empires and religions, and the careful architectures of human self-definition. And they are patient. They have been patient for millions of years. They can be patient for millions more. The Imperium noted the loss of Theta 17 with the administrative indifference of an organism shedding a single cell. The research staff were declared casualties of a reactor malfunction, a tragic but inevitable consequence of maintaining stations in hostile environments. Their names were entered into the appropriate ledgers, prayers were said by priests who had never met them, and the machinery of governance continued its inexorable function. Inquisitor Valina Cross, who had authorized the initial excavation, reviewed the final reports from her chambers aboard the fortress monastery, Eternal Vigilance. The data was fragmentary, corrupted, ultimately inconclusive. The skull's nature remained unknown, its origins remained unclear. She ordered all physical evidence destroyed. All personnel who had reviewed the documentation were reassigned to frontier posts where astropathic communication was unreliable and life expectancy measured in months rather than years. The sector was quarantined, not officially. Official quarantines left records, created questions. This was a softer erasure, a gradual withdrawal of resources and attention until the region simply ceased to exist in any meaningful administrative sense. In her private moments, Cross wondered what Gregorius had seen in that laboratory. What truth had been worth destroying an entire station to suppress? She had served the Imperium for 90 years, had witnessed horrors that would drive lesser minds to catatonia. And yet something about Theta 17 disturbed her in a way she could not articulate. Perhaps because the horror was not that we had found something inhuman. The horror was that we had found something that suggested humanity itself was the aberration, the mutation, the deliberate reduction of something vast and strange into a shape small enough to control. The Imperium ruled 1,000,000 worlds, and claimed to do so in humanity's name. But what if humanity was not the inheritors of the galaxy? What if we were refugees, hiding from a truth too large to bear, building walls of doctrine and faith and genetic purity to keep out the memory of what we had once been? What if the Emperor himself knew, and that knowledge was the real reason he sat entombed on the golden throne, maintaining the Astronomicon not as a light to guide us home, but as a barrier to keep something out or keep something in. These were questions Cross did not permit herself to pursue. Questions were doors, and some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. She deleted the final files, purged the backups, submitted a report that satisfied all bureaucratic requirements while revealing nothing of substance. Theta. 17 became a number in a ledger, and then not even that. But memory, true memory, is not stored in documents or data cores. It is written into the structure of existence itself, into the way particles spin and quantum states collapse. It persists in the dreams of tech priests who wake gasping, certain they have forgotten something crucial. In the prayers of priests who find themselves speaking words in languages they do not know. In the genetic code of every human being, in those dormant sequences that serve no function, carry no apparent information, and yet remain, generation after generation, stubbornly refusing to be edited out. Somewhere in the ultima segmentum, on a world with no name, the wind moves through broken spires that are no longer there. It carries with it the ghost of sound, not quite music, not quite language, that might be the echo of a question that was asked and answered and then erased. Or perhaps it is the sound of something waiting, waiting to be remembered, waiting to remind us what we were before we decided to be only human. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But beneath the war, older than the war, patient as the turning of galaxies, there is the question we have spent 10,000 years refusing to answer. What are we really? And in the spaces between stars, in the quantum uncertainty of existence itself, something that might once have been a skull, or many skulls, or the idea of skulls, continues to dream the answer, not in defiance of humanity, but in memory of what humanity was always supposed to become. The answer waits in the bone, in the deep code of our being, in the template written in flesh and time, and one day, on some distant world, in some future or past or present that exists in superposition with our own, someone will find another skull, and the question will be asked again, and perhaps, next time, we will be brave enough to hear the answer. In the darkness, something ancient turns its attention toward Terra. It has been waiting for a very long time. It can wait a little longer. After all, it knows where we're going. It knows because it's where we've always been going. It knows because in every cell, every gene, every forgotten dream, we're still trying to remember how to get home.